webinar, Making Mediation a Strategic Priority, hosted by mediation expert David Liddell. My name is Michelle Gregory and I'm the Communications Manager at TCM Group, and I will be joining you on the webinar today to ask some questions of David as we go along. And now I would like to hand over to David.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and a very, very warm welcome here to this webinar focusing on something I know which is very important for a number of organisations, and that's how to resolve difficult situations that arise during times of conflict, change or crisis within our organisations. I'm sure a number of people here on the webinar today will be familiar with some of the role and the benefits of mediation. In fact, I know some of you are already mediating within your organisations or as mediators, so I'm sure you will understand and appreciate the passion that I have for the role that mediation can play in creating an environment and creating the conditions for two parties to come together and have a mature and adult conversation and find a successful remedy to their difficult situation. Avoiding the costs of conflict, reducing the stress, increasing productivity, really promoting a sense of well-being and achievement for the parties to give them an opportunity to go back to work with a sense of a newfound relationship, a newfound opportunity, something that they can work on and develop, rather than the historic conflict which we know is damaging and destructive to the relationship and causes high levels of stress and anxiety. There is no doubt at all that mediation is gaining major traction within many UK organisations, and that's a good thing. We can't fall out with someone in the UK anymore without being offered mediation. We can't go to court, we can't go through a divorce, we can't sue the builder who put the dodgy extension on the side of our house without being offered an opportunity to mediate. And increasingly, in a workplace and employment setting, that's exactly the same. But where the challenge lies for a great many organisations is a shift from perceiving mediation as a transactional process, supporting two parties to reach a resolution, and embedding it into the culture, the fabric, the systems, the process, and ultimately the strategy of the organisation. I've been working with a great many organisations across large corporate organisations, Whitehall departments, and various other organisations to help them embed mediation into their organisation at a strategic level, securing the buy-in from the board and other senior decision makers within their organisation. So throughout the webinar, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions if you wish, an opportunity for you to present any thoughts or feedback you have. The aspect of having you mediation as a strategic priority within your organisation. Michelle will keep an eye on the dashboard and pick up any questions as they come through, and she will also field those through the day. So and we'll try and make this webinar as interactive as we can, knowing how challenging webinars can be. So just a little bit of an insight. I know some of you may have already heard me talk about mediation and may know a little bit about my journey, but just for those of you who haven't met me before, just a little bit about myself. So I began work in this area back in the early 90s, following a degree in race relations. I went on to work in Leicester in the area of social and economic regeneration. My role was to involve hard-to-reach communities, particularly black and minority ethnic communities, in a program called SRB, Single Regeneration Budget. SRB1 as it was. It wasn't successful, and I felt that one of the barriers to communities engaging effectively in regeneration strategies were high levels of unresolved conflict and tension within those communities. I also felt that the provision for dispute resolution and promotion of issues resolution within our communities was woefully inadequate. Some may suggest that's not changed much, but certainly we are seeing an increasing emphasis on programs like restorative justice, community conferencing, restorative conferencing, so on and so forth. So I set up a mediation program in Leicester, promoting mediation and dialogue building between different groups within communities, and saw firsthand the power, the transformational power of mediation in some very tough settings. I set up and ran various programs. I set up a program called CRIS, the Conflict Resolution in Schools program, promoting mediation in classrooms and playgrounds across Leicestershire, and increasingly that became a UK-wide initiative. And I was working actively in the area of restorative justice. In 2001, I set up the TCM group, stands for Total Conflict Management, helping organisations embed the principles of restorative justice, restorative processes, mediation and non-violence to help them address issues of conflict, bullying, harassment, discrimination, disputes, quarrels, fights, disagreements, not seeing eye to eye, grievances. Of course, it goes by many names, and what I was helping organisations to do was find a constructive, sustainable, effective outcome through dialogue. I felt working in organisations that the context would be different to the thing within communities. I felt it would be perhaps more professional, that the environment would allow for parties to come together and have a dialogue, that collaborative or consensus-based processes would be central to the organisation's strategy, to the practices of managers, and embedded into the HR policies and procedures. And much like my first experience of non-violence and dispute resolution within a community environment, my first impression of organisational approaches to issues resolution was they were woefully inadequate. In fact, when I was talking to employees in organisations who'd experienced conflicts and disputes, they were describing the same impact to me of the dispute: sleeplessness, feeling sick coming into work, can't meet their manager without a feeling of apprehension and vulnerability. The exact same symptoms as people who'd had their houses robbed and burgled or had their handbags snatched at a bus stop. And I asked HR professionals, what do you do? What do you do to create a space for the parties to come together and have a dialogue? And they proudly pointed to a paragraph in a grievance procedure called informal resolution. And the good news is there's a recognition that informal resolution, whether it's a sentence, a couple of sentences, or a series of paragraphs in a grievance procedure, is in itself not sufficient to help resolve the challenging issues that exist in a complex, diverse and dynamic workplace. And today's webinar I'm going to be presenting to you perhaps some fairly radical, some call them progressive, some call them idealistic, others call them naive. Some people call the approach happy clappy and pink and fluffy. I call it talking and listening to each other. And what I'll be doing today is presenting to you opportunities for your organisation to embed the principles of dialogue, of talking and listening to each other, into the organisation's fabric, strategy and systems. And again, when we're working with organisations, we help them to map what is operating for dialogue and force against dialogue. One of the challenges for yourselves from post this webinar is perhaps to look at your own organisation and look at the forces that promote dialogue within your business and within your organisation. And today I'll be sharing with you some innovative approaches. As I said, it's not progressive, it's not naive, it's not idealistic, it's not pink and fluffy, it's not happy clappy, it's talking, it's listening, it's finding a solution. So today what I'll cover with you, and please do ask questions along the way, I really would value the chance to hear your thoughts. How to make your board sit up and take notice of conflict. I often work with HR teams who really get mediation. They're now buying into this. They can see it's the key. In fact, I was speaking with the International Employee Relations Manager of a large retailer who said to me mediation now is the central tenet of their employee relations strategy within that global organisation. So HR will get this. What we do find is often boards haven't necessarily sat up and taken notice of conflict, so they'll help you to get their attention. Mediation and resolution approaches that are grafted onto the organisation or bolted on are not effective. Mediation or resolution approaches which are embedded into the organisation, which are part of the culture and the fabric, the systems and the strategy of the organisation are effective. They deliver tangible benefits and a real return on investment. Today I'll share with you some ideas of how to embed mediation at a strategic level and how to overcome some of the obstacles. The dispute resolution culture within many of our organisations, as I'll argue, and you've perhaps heard me say this before, is based on a binary form of justice, which is predicated on I win, you lose, I'm right, you're wrong, and we go through some kind of process or mechanism in order to be able to prove or disprove the case. Generally that mechanism exists not to resolve the dispute, but generally it exists to protect the employer from any future litigation or reputational harm. It's an adversarial, it's an outdated, it's an outmoded system of dispute resolution. It doesn't meet the needs of the organisation and it systemically fails on almost every level. Today we'll look at how to transform from that mechanism into something which embraces dialogue and gets parties talking. And I'll talk to you about a model resolution policy which is now being embedded within organisations across the UK as an alternative to some of the more outmoded grievance procedures that exist. I think to start the webinar, I need to just take us back a few steps and think about conflict and just try and understand how and why we get into conflict and the organisation's response. Let's imagine that we're sat in a meeting with our manager, we've presented a report, and the manager says, well, that was a load of rubbish, wasn't it? That report, quite frankly, was a waste of time. Wow, that's quite a shocking thing for a manager to say to me in a public meeting. I need to be respected and valued and nurtured and looked after by my manager. Valued by my manager, those needs are no longer there. And that gives me a sense of profound loss, a loss of hope, a loss of confidence, a loss of esteem, a loss of, what's the point, a loss of a future. And that drives me to react. We know the fight or flight, the freeze or fall reaction that we have to conflict. That drives emotional and psychological responses, very powerful ones. And that then will impact on how I act, interact and react to my manager. So I go to my manager and say, look, I found your behaviour really quite inappropriate, but I'd like to talk through with you and explain the impact of your behaviour, and please will you take a time to explain the intention behind what you said, because it's very powerful. Or do I go to my desk and feel very stressed out and very sick, and within only a matter of time look for a new job, or go to see my doctor to exit the business on sick leave? So the behaviours that we see, the destructive behaviours, arise from the needs not being met, giving rise to the loss. Our organisations are very good at handling destructive behaviours. The destructive behaviours we can map: shouting, threatening, withdrawing, not communicating, emailing one another. And organisations are very good at resolving the destructive behaviours through process, but they're less effective at understanding the unmet needs that the parties have and creating the conditions for dialogue which allows those unmet needs to be discussed, to turn the loss into a gain of understanding, of empathy, of insight and awareness that can only come through dialogue. The effective resolution system within an organisation, which allows for mediation to happen between parties, either by managers or internal mediators or external mediators, allows the parties to share their needs, to define the loss, and to gain understanding and insight. So the effective resolution system is about transforming conflict from destructive, this conflict, constructive. The existing processes that exist within our organisations, I'm in particular thinking about grievance processes, but you may have others. They're reactive. They don't focus on the needs and the interests, the goals, the loss of the party. They focus on the behaviours. And they react to the behaviours only when they've been flagged to such a serious level, generally often weeks or months or sometimes years after the original event occurs. They're inherently adversarial. They pitch people against each other on the basis of I'm right and you're wrong. It creates a polarity that's very hard then to break. So when I'm invited to go into informal resolution, I've already polarised. I'm already at one end of the spectrum, and that end of the spectrum generally is I'm right and the other person's wrong. It's very unusual to go into a dispute resolution like this where one of the parties is coming up and saying, you know something, I'm really wrong, and I'd like to go into an environment to have a dialogue and explain how wrong I am. Generally, the polarity is I'm right and the other person's wrong. And our organisation's policies, the very same policies that you've designed to resolve disputes in your organisation, are actually perpetuating this polarisation and entrenchment. So they don't identify the root cause of the conflict. They don't identify the needs of the parties. And therefore the needs of your individuals, the future success of your business, locked in the talent of the people who you employ, are not being given voice and not being given an opportunity to share their concerns. And therefore your business needs, the need for competitive advantage, to generate new initiatives, to be innovative, are not being met. And that impedes the strategy of your business. You may be in a growing business environment, you may be flatlining, or your business may be going through some decline. Whatever your business strategy is, it's about helping develop a strong and sustainable business for the future. Disputes and dispute resolution systems actually need that. So we're just
apologies, my fault. Trying to see if we had questions.
Right, yes. So we just lost the dashboard there for a moment. So if you have got any questions, sorry we've not picked them up. We're just going to try and get the dashboard back up so we can see it. There we go. So the dispute resolution procedures also for creativity and impede innovation and create a culture of grievance, entitlement or litigation within your organisation. You may or may not agree with some of what I'm saying here, but I always am interested to hear from people if they have any positive experiences of grievance. In positive experiences of grievance, where the parties, all parties and the business go through the process and come out at the other end and say, do you know something? We've grown, we've learnt, we've strengthened our relationship. We're in a better place now because of this grievance than we were before the grievance started. If anybody has got an example of where grievance has added value to your organisation, I would love to hear it. I'd love to post it on my website as an example of best practice, because I've been saying this at conferences for many years, conferences and exhibitions and webinars and seminars, and no one yet has sent me an example of a grievance process that's genuinely added value to the business. Certainly not the grievances that I'm talking about here, grievances in relation to relationship breakdown. So boards are interested in this, but they don't necessarily know what they don't know. They devolve a lot of the responsibility for these issues to the HR team. They often assume that this stuff is happening. They may know if there's an expensive employment tribunal or settlement agreement that crosses their desk, but generally boards are not aware of some of the issues that are occurring in relation to dispute resolution. I would suggest and argue vehemently that boards should be aware and need to be aware of what's happening. So when I present to executive management teams and boards about the changing culture from adversarial to non-adversarial processes, these are the questions that boards are asking me. Now, what is the real cost of conflict to our business? And we help them to measure that, the time that's been spent, the real cost, the human cost and the financial cost. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, how many sick days have we lost as a result of conflict? What's really going on for our organisation? How many grievances do we get? How much do these grievances cost us? What impact does conflict have on our employee engagement levels? I was at a presentation last week with Nita Clark from Engage for Success, and Nita said very clearly, it's a very powerful message and it stuck with me, mistrust is the antithesis of employee engagement. And what's the one thing that I always hear as a mediator when I start speaking to the parties about their dispute is they can't trust each other. So there is a direct relationship for organisations who are trying to drive up their engagement levels on a transactional or transformational basis and unresolved conflict in the workplace. We can't ignore this stuff. Boards are saying, well, how much time do our managers spend dealing with conflicts and disputes? The CIPD suggests that 30% of managers' time is spent dealing with this. I think if you talk to some managers in organisations where conflict is the norm and unresolved tension seems to be the constant, they tell me it's much, much more time. Do our customers experience a negative impact within the NHS? And there's an interesting article in The Guardian today about the role of mediation within the NHS and the impact on patient experience and patient outcomes, clinical outcomes. But there's a direct correlation between how staff are working together and communicating with each other and how your customers experience your business. If you call the call centre and the two telephonists have been rowing just before you call, you're not going to get the same level of service as you would if they were working in a more collaborative space. And call centres, as we know, are hotbeds of conflict. And critically, managers say to me, so what do we do for our managers to spot issues and nip them in the bud? What training do we deliver? And often I'll hear is, well, we have some soft skills training for some of our managers, but we haven't really been investing an awful lot in that. I think the word soft skills is often anathema. These are hard skills. And there should be a mandatory requirement as part of every manager's leadership and development program, learning and development program. Emotional intelligence and negotiation skills should be a core competence embedded in the leadership competency framework. Again, how many of our leaders are recruited because of their technical skills and know-how, but when it comes to addressing people management issues, which are complex and sophisticated, do they find themselves inadequately trained and supported? They don't have the confidence, the competence, and the capability to resolve these issues adequately. So here's a toolkit. We have a number of toolkits at TCM. And I thought I'd share this one with you, but we have many others. And if you're interested in measuring the real cost of conflict to your organisation, please do drop me an email after this webinar, and I'll be very happy to send you more information about how we can help you to really measure the cost of conflict We've got some great tools and devices that we've been developing over many, many years. But this is a simple device. This is a summary of that. So we look at the various players involved in a dispute. So generally what I'd recommend is asking one of your HR assistants or HR consultants to go back to your grievance files, find the 2, 3, 4 grievances that have run the course over the last 12 months. And one of the good things, of course, is you will have an audit trail of those grievances. And then undertake a reasonably forensic level analysis of the time spent by each of these players during the dispute resolution mechanism. Now we know that the gross annual salary divided by 260 days gives you a rough cost per day. You've got the various stakeholders down the left-hand column you can add or remove as required, and along the top each of the rows covers each of the different stages that you may have gone through. Again, you can add or remove those according to local context. Out at the end, having run this through a grievance, will come a cost of conflict. I think you'll be surprised at the real cost. The lowest figures I've seen are £2,000. The highest figures I've seen are well in excess of £100,000. In fact, in some organisations, they're nearing £1 million for cases that have been extremely litigious and extremely complicated. Run that out as a mean across 3, 5 cases, and that will give you a mean cost of conflict. This will get the attention of your board, because your board are having to make difficult decisions about how to allocate resources right now. And if they weren't having to spend money on these issues, could the money being spent, could the opportunity costs that come in as a result of the conflict be used elsewhere? And of course, what we help organisations do through focus groups, employee surveys, on-site meetings, various different activities, is develop the cost of conflict understanding, develop metrics that help them to understand the real cost of conflict, and then from that build a resolution scheme that's based on evidence. So when we're investigating and evaluating the resolution program in 2 or 3 years' time, we've got something to measure back against in terms of the overall success or effectiveness. And mediation programs or resolution schemes that are set up with a clear evidence base are more effective and more sustainable, and are likely to have more board commitment and buy-in because of the return on investment measures that can be created. You can get return on investment measures from these initiatives. When people say it's difficult, well, it is difficult, but it's not impossible. And in order to be able to get the attention of our boards and drive mediation as a strategic priority, we have to demonstrate that we're making a real contribution and adding real value to our organisations. And here's my quote that often will helps me to feel passionate about mediation, even when I'm locked in a difficult negotiation late into the afternoon when I'm mediating between two parties. This quote reminds me, and I hope it would remind you also as an organisation, that conflicts can and often are very, very positive and constructive. The most intense conflicts, if they can be overcome, and the if is often about dialogue and mediation, if they can be overcome, they leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. It's just these intense conflicts and their conflagration, the heat and the explosion of the conflict, which are needed to produce valuable and lasting results. This is Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist. Bruce Tuckman tells us that teams go through 4 stages of development, of which the second, once we've formed, we storm. Forming, storming, norming, and performing. So teams are going to go through conflict. So there's one certainty about conflict your organisation will experience it. The second certainty is if it's managed well, it can make relationships stronger. So why is it that conflict management and dispute resolution seems to me to be the part of the organisation which receives the least attention, which is not a strategic function of the organisation, where managers are not equipped and capable to address these issues, and in essence the organisation, unfortunately, in many cases, do not have the capability or the capacity to resolve these issues effectively. So having set a bit of context, what I'd like to do is share with you now some thoughts about how an organisation may integrate mediation into their systems and processes and working at a strategic level. So the following slide offers you a map of an organisation in the context of how they handle and manage disputes and conflict. So the green arrow on the left-hand side represents the psychological contract. So of course we know the psychological contract is formed, often at interview, it's certainly then developed through the recruitment and intaking process, and then from the moment I start work, I'm starting to make subjective analysis of promises and commitments that my manager and employer are making to me. The psychological contract is the most important contract that exists in my employment. It's one of the most important aspects of effective employee relations. In terms of human resources management, it underpins every aspect of HR management and HR strategy. Yet when I ask people if they have heard of the term, it's very unusual. For me, it's everything in relation to dispute resolution. So when we look at the conflict at the early stage, we get a breakdown of a communication between myself and my manager. I feel that they blamed me, that there's been some kind of a negative attack on me. And the approach there often is to panic and avoid. So the manager panics, they don't know how to cope with it, they avoid dealing with it. The employee might go sick or withdraw, or it becomes a clique or some form of alliance. Productivity starts to fall. We see morale and engagement dropping off, and there's more of a blame game develops within the relationship. We start to see attack and defend even as we're starting to adopt our positions. Of course, your employees are vulnerable, as are your managers, as are your HR professionals. The organisation is vulnerable at this stage. But very little is done at the early stage to resolve these issues. So we move on to a slight level of escalation here. Then we start to describe HR. I'm going to go to HR. There's no HR as a threat. Going to HR is seen as a threat against the colleagues. A crazy situation. Going to HR is an opportunity to find resolution. Shouldn't be issued as a threat. I'll take out a grievance. Again, is issued as a threat. Or actually, the taking out of a grievance happens. We stress. We see a doctor. We go off sick. We become dissatisfied, not dissatisfied necessarily just with the manager's response, but also with the organisation's reaction to my conflict. Now it's not just me and my manager, the whole organisation are against me. I can't put up with it anymore, I'm going to have to leave. And then what we start to see is it becomes more serious, it's high levels of escalation, it becomes binary, right, wrong, win, lose, it's costly, more and more time is spent here, there's little hope of a satisfactory outcome. And what I find within our organisations is the majority of time, if you can see me, you'd see me pointing at my screen, but most of the time and money is spent at the thin end of the wedge. And I don't know, I don't understand why that is, but it tends to be the time and money is spent at the end of it rather than at the beginning. I don't know if that's something about our organisation's psyche and culture. At the top, the orange box, the orange triangle at the top, is the board, it's the governance structure that exists within our organisations. We often see low engagement from boards in these issues and low engagement from senior management teams, apart from in the occasion where they have to address these issues. The HR paradox exists. The HR paradox, which I define as, on one hand, the HR director and their team are driving engagement, improving well-being, creating an environment where talent can flourish, and you want to attract talent to the business. And on the other hand, HR are the custodians of these procedures and processes which are draconian and destructive and adversarial. People can't understand it. What is HR all about? If there's nothing else, resolution offers HR a great chance of some good PR, I often say. On the other side of the slide, we've got, so as the psychological contract breaks down, we then pick out our employment contract. And this again is where a large amount of time and money is spent on the other side of the dotted line when the individual has decided that they've got to leave. Either they've been dismissed, they might claim unfairly, or they feel they have no choice but to leave, in which case they might take an unfair constructive dismissal. But nonetheless, they've gone, the relationship's over, all of the money you've spent and invested in them, all of the energy that they bought on the day they were interviewed and that amazing day where they got the letter offering them the job, that's just walked out of your door, and now you need to spend time on maybe some conciliation through ACAS. You may be able to reach some form of a settlement agreement. It might cost you 20, 30k, but it'd probably be worth it to save reputation. And of course, in a number of cases, we find employment tribunals playing a role. And what I'm finding when I talk to lawyers, when I talk to government officials and others, even at a ministerial level, the focus still is on the right-hand side there, the purple triangle. And what I would suggest to those of you on the webinar today is the real focus should be on the green triangle at the thick end of the wedge, at the early stage, supporting supervisors, managers, human resources professionals, occupational health professionals, and unions to embed a culture of resolution. And this is what you could like if you were to think about how you adopted a resolution culture. You'd have an early triage of issues by trained managers or HR professionals who are trained to spot issues quickly and properly. there'd be a real emphasis on early resolution within your organisation's policies and procedures. You wouldn't have a grievance procedure, you have a resolution policy which promoted early resolution. Your managers would be trained in a fantastic program, Better Resolution, securing positive outcomes in difficult times and supporting the devolution of the 4 key HR policies to your managers, supporting them to handle and resolve grievances at an early stage, to handle performance issues at an early stage, to handle absence issues at an early stage, and to issue oral or verbal warnings to be able to maintain the integrity and the esteem of the people that they're managing. And mediation being offered early by internal mediators, maybe by managers, HR professionals or others. So the model resolution organisation has an enormous amount of emphasis on that early stage. At the very top of the screen, you'll see that the resolution programme is linked to the vision, the values and the strategy of the organisation. There's board level commitment. There's a resolution scheme governance framework in place. There are clear objectives for resolution. There's clear engagement of key stakeholders, unions, occupational health, HR, and you regularly and constantly monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of your mediation programme. And the HR function drive a culture of resolution within the organisation. HR are no longer a threat. There's no longer an HR paradox. When I talk to my HR business partner or my HR manager, what do? They help me to resolve the issues in order to be able to give of my best in my organisation. And that's what HR do. That's what HR are. They coach, they mentor, they mediate, they support, they nurture, they foster a culture of resolution in my organisation. Of course, there is a thin end of the wedge. There'll always be a thin end of the wedge. But even in that stage where there's a formal resolution, clearly there's a right to representation at that stage and a right to appeal. But even when we come to formal resolution, which replaces formal grievance meetings, we still look for opportunities to restore relationships. And this is absolutely vital. And for those of you who are wondering, would this meet the ACAS code and on discipline and grievance? It's not meeting the code, but would you or would you not be successful at an employment tribunal? Employment tribunals don't care what you call your policy. They don't care whether you call it a grievance procedure or going out for a cup of coffee procedure or a resolution policy. What they care about is that you, the employer, have taken reasonable steps to resolve the issues and you've met the minimum guidelines laid down within the ACAS code on discipline and grievance. Well, the model resolution policy in here does exactly that. And ACAS, Andrew Warren in particular, spoke recently at a conference supporting the work that I've been developing here and promoting a resolution policy. You could see that this would be highly effective were organisations to embed this kind of policy. Maybe it is time to take our grievance procedures shredder and change them and redefine them. So how could you do that? Is it radical? Is it too radical? Could you really make that step and change the way your organisation thinks and works? By the way, I will send the slides out to everyone on this webinar, so you've got a copy of the slides after this as well. And certainly that model organisation, I welcome your thoughts and feedback on that. I know many of you understand and know mediation, so I won't spend too much on this, but we know it's an adversarial way of resolving difficult situations. It's an alternative or an adjunct to formal processes. And mediation is a mindset, it's a way of thinking, it's a framework, it's a verb to mediate within a process, and it's also a set of skills we can use as managers and HR professionals, employee relations specialists, to promote dialogue, to encourage conciliatory thinking, to focus on the interests and needs of the parties rather than the position they've adopted. And therefore, I would argue to you and your board that you already employ the best mediators you're ever going to have in your organisation. They're your managers. And your managers, when they can be trained to have the right mindset, to have a framework that they can be confident in, and to have the skills at their disposal to promote dialogue, they are a more effective, more powerful management function within your organisation. Of course, it's not always possible for a manager to mediate. You may need someone who's external to the organisation, or a pool of mediators. The mediator is a neutral person. They help the parties have an open and honest conversation, helping them to have an outcome which is win-win based on their mutual needs and goals. Mediation, therefore, is about collaborating rather than blaming. And even in those hardened disputes, where the parties say to me, David, the only outcome I want is for the person to be sacked, to be humiliated, maybe if they were to write me a letter of apology in blood and pin it to the door of my office, then I may be magnanimous enough to forgive them. And actually, when they go through that process and think and see the outcome, they say to me, David, you know something, I've got a hollow feeling in the pit of my belly. It didn't give me what I wanted. What I really wanted was to be understood, to have a voice, to be heard, and to get back to the job I was first employed to do. And blame gets right in the way of all of that happening. The agreement in mediation comes from the parties. This is what really separates mediation from other processes. We don't tell the parties what to do, how to work, how to live, what kind of agreement they should have. We don't judge them. We help them find their own solutions. And one of the powerful messages within mediation is parties enter into it willingly because they want to, because they can see the power of resolution, and it's confidential. But going to that point on voluntary and confidential, as an employer, it is perfectly reasonable for you to expect your employee to engage fully in a resolution process that you've designed in consultation with your very same employees. Is it reasonable for mediation to be offered to an employee and for it to be rejected out of hand at the first instance without having considered it? I would suggest it's probably not reasonable. I think developing a triage process and a level of information, and if we look at the family courts, the development of mediation information advisory sessions, MIAMs, they provide mediation to the divorcing parties to enable them to make an informed decision about the role of mediation. I think employers who really provide high-quality information and inform the parties to a dispute at an early stage actually see high levels of engagement. Bolting mediation into a grievance procedure, unfortunately, the bad news is people probably won't engage in it. So the resolution framework, this is where it gets very interesting. For those of you in an OD role or an HR role, you may already be thinking this could actually work in other areas of our business. Well, it does. Of course, mediation and resolution can support workplace and employment dispute resolution. In essence, much of what we do at TCM is about that. But we see resolution supported in consumer disputes, and the ADR directive, which comes into effect in 2015, which doesn't sound very far away, will require organisations to make much greater use of online dispute resolution and ADR initiatives for consumer disputes. But I set up the Metropolitan Police Service Complaints Conciliation Service through the Department of Professional Standards. We work closely with NHS organisations providing patient complaints conciliation and mediation services. We see mediation offered as part of health and wellbeing programmes. I know I was at a conference recently with Dame Carol Black, and it occurred to me that mediation plus medication plus meditation are perhaps the three pillars of future for employee relations. That went down well on Twitter, by the way. I don't know but nonetheless, mediation, medication, and meditation. Supporting the role of leaders, underpinning employee engagement. I'm on the Engage for Success group. I'm one of the gurus on the group and speak and talk a lot about the role of mediation and giving employees a voice, helping managers to walk the talk. And using these resolution approaches at times of change within our organisations. So I'll begin to finish off the session really thinking about how you can how you can set up your resolution programme and introducing you to the model resolution policy. There haven't been any questions yet, so I don't know if anyone does have any questions, but if you have them, please do feel free to ask them. I hope that what I'm saying is useful. Feel free to tell me if it is or isn't as we're going along. So finally then, so setting up a resolution programme within your organisation, engaging all of your key stakeholders, I think, is key. Speaking to the unions, occupation and health and others. Undertaking a conflict audit of your organisation and developing that conflict competence strategy that we talked about earlier. So you've got a clear strategic direction with which you're aiming towards within your organisation. We've developed an online dispute resolution system called Apaxio within TCM, helping organisations to manage their mediation and resolution services through an online, very powerful portal, which is in use in many organisations now. Embedding mediation into relevant policies or procedures, and indeed developing resolution policy as an alternative to grievance. Recruiting, selecting and training a team of mediators may be useful for you to have a pool, and we've trained in-house mediators in over 300 organisations now across the UK, from departments in work and pensions and transport for London, Marks and Spencer's, right the way through to small not-for-profit organisations and small and medium-sized businesses. And keep publicising, celebrating and evaluating your mediation scheme. And having grown up in Nottingham, a little nod there to Brian Clough, the former manager of Nottingham Forest. This is a real Cloughie, and Rome wasn't built in a day, But I wasn't on that particular job, said Clough, I'm sure. But what it reminds me is it takes time to shift the culture. I'm sure had Brian Clough been in charge of changing our culture, I'm sure which direction we've gone in actually, but he may have done it more quickly. So keep evaluating the cost of competence, embedding it into your policy, that's training HR to coach and mentor managers, and training your managers and leaders to secure effective outcomes are 4 of the key steps that I would recommend helping to become conflict competent. Arcadia, one of the many organisations we work with, obviously the owners of the brands, particularly Topshop and Topman where we've worked closely and continue to do so, helping to embed their mediation programme across their HR team and across the group as a whole. And last year they were successful in winning the Personnel Today Award for Innovation and Dispute Resolution, which they were obviously extremely proud of. So the model resolution policy, again, everyone on the webinar will receive a free copy of this, and this is version 1. Version 2 will be launched early in the new year with increased toolkits and handy hints for organisations. So we will send you a revised version of this resolution policy. I'm pleased to report that one large local authority, I found out earlier this week, 40,000 employees, has just had final approval to go ahead and implement a model resolution policy. The Law Society, where we launched the model resolution policy back in May last year, were one of the first organisations certainly to embrace and see the positive side of moving towards a resolution culture. In fact, we had over 85 organisations, Michelle, I think, all of whom said that they want to move in this general direction.
98% of delegates all put their hand up to say that they wanted to change it.
Fantastic. So we're seeing a real shift in mindset. And this is why a grievance is formal, it's adversarial, it's destructive. Resolution is informal, it's safe, it's about collaboration, it's interest-based, and it is positive. So I can see we've had a question there. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to Michelle with her question.
Okay, so we just had this question come in, and the question starts off with, I have acted as a mediator, as an HR manager, successfully and unsuccessfully. I think there can sometimes be a role in conflict for HR professionals acting as mediators.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that question. So I would agree. I think HR are very well placed to act as a mediator and peacemaker within their organisations. HR do have a challenge in terms of their impartiality. They are custodians ultimately of the employment contract and the policies that underpin that. But I think managers, HR managers and HR VPs who promote coaching, mentoring and mediation, that kind of family of approaches, actually can drive better outcomes and create the kind of culture where people want to go to HR because they know that HR are going to help them to find the solution that they're looking for, rather than going to HR being seen as a threat or in some respects seen as negative. So I celebrate the work you've been doing there. And, it's not always going to be successful, but generally it is. So what's different about the model resolution policy? Well, I think you've probably heard a lot about the policy and started to get how to embed this into your organisation strategically. So the new resolution policy is a new approach to grievance and complaints resolution. It's values-based, so it aligns to the values of your organisation. And one of the first challenges for yourselves is, if you're sitting there thinking, well, what are the values of our organisation, is go and remind yourself of the values and see how the mediation and resolution approach that I'm describing aligns itself to the values of your organisation. Prepare a presentation, therefore, for your executive management team, and aligning the values of mediation and resolution to the values of your organisation, coupled with evidence. My experience of working with executive management teams is they will give us the space and the time to have these kind of conversations. So it's a values-based approach, not a positions-based approach. There's enhanced triage of cases at an early stage. There's much more emphasis on mediation and early resolution. It remains voluntary, and as I said, it's compliant with the ACAS code. And there are toolkits and more tools will be developed in the new year, supporting managers, HR and employees and unions as well. We're working closely with the TUC and other organisations to understand the need of these key stakeholders. And Sarah Veal at the TUC has been very supportive of the work that we've been doing here at TCM to promote this culture, and we look forward to continuing developing our relationship with that organisation going forward. It promotes and encourages positive relationships and constructive dialogue. The model resolution policy is about leaders and managers walking the talk. No longer can we stick our head in the sand and hope the conflict will go away. It won't go away. At best, it will creep up in the organisation. At worst, it's going to end up in an employment tribunal. And the policy draws on 5 key principles, principles that everyone in the conflict tells me are important: to be treated fairly, to be treated with respect, for someone to understand and for me to understand their point of view in an empathetic way, to have a dignified conversation, to promote dialogue. And if we look at those 5 principles and look at the successful modern business, those principles are directly aligned to the effective business driving competitive advantage. It therefore, for me, is key to success. So I've kind of gone a bit, I've got a lot of slides here. You won't believe me when I said that before the webinar. I was actually going through cutting slides out. There's so much to say about this. I do run other webinars, and apologies, I've just gone over the allotted time. But just to summarise, for the individuals, employees, it's important that they raise the issues early, that they do engage in dialogue with the other party. It's not reasonable just to say, no, I don't want to do this. There's an expectation from you, the employer, that they will do that. It's built into the fabric of your expectations. That they will engage in early evaluation of dispute, and they expect to be treated with compassion. But they understand that mediation will be offered in all cases to them, but they do have the right to request a formal meeting with the right to representation at that meeting if they feel that the more informal approach isn't right. That HR will provide a coaching and mentoring service for managers. They'll provide an early assessment system for disputes. They'll coordinate and organise the internal mediation scheme or an outsourced scheme. They'll support resolution meetings and evaluate the scheme. And our managers will engage in resolution skills training. It's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. They'll possess and be praised against core resolution competences. They'll foster a culture of constructive engagement and resolution within teams. It's just a fantastic opportunity for managers to really engage with their teams in a different way. Facilitating dialogue and walking the talk, really listening. Every good conversation starts with listening. Let's help our managers to do that. So I don't know if anyone's got any other questions, but if you do, please feel free to ask them either now or through. You'll get a little feedback form from the webinar people, and also you're very welcome to email me with thoughts or comments. I am able to come and deliver presentations to boards. I run regular workshops, generally free of charge, here in London and across the UK, talking about mediation. We'll get into a lot of more detail around mediation and embedding in mediation. So there's lots that I can provide to support you. So in conclusion, mediation is, I would argue, I suppose, as a mediator, but evidence is now supporting that mediation is the most effective form of dispute resolution available. Better resolution training for your managers is vital. We can't just leave our managers to make it up as they go along. Adopting a holistic and strategic approach to mediation is going to be the most effective, and mediation delivers real benefit and return on investment. So I hope I've given you some thoughts and pointers to how to make mediation a strategic priority within your organisation. I'm active on LinkedIn. There's lots of very useful debate and discussion. This webinar will be posted on YouTube. We'll also put it on LinkedIn, so please feel free to forward it to colleagues, or to like it on our various social media environments. And I'm conscious of time, Michelle, but is there any other key questions that you'd like to ask or that have come up through the webinar?
I think we've had all the questions we are going to have for today, so please do feel free to send it through. For myself, I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us and for your feedback that some people have already sent through already, which is very kind. Just to let you know, we have a series of webinars coming up. The next one is going to be on January the 22nd, which is Leadership, Mediation and Emotional Intelligence, Developing the Leaders of Tomorrow. And actually the next day we have one specifically for those working in the NHS, which is resolving patient complaints within the NHS. As I said, we do a range of webinars. We're always looking for outside speakers and case studies. So if you'd be interested in speaking, please let us know, and we obviously will be approaching you as well. And just a quick reminder about our 15% off Christmas offer, which ends on the 17th of December. It's the first 12 working days of Christmas. It's 15% off across our services and training. And on behalf of David and the rest of the TCM group, would like to wish you a happy Christmas and a happy New Year.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for joining us, and looking forward to working with you in 2014. Thank you all very, very much indeed, and happy mediating.